What's up, guys? Ryan here, and today we're going to be talking about cables and all of the different aspects that can make a cable good or bad. And we're going to be looking at some myths and some facts surrounding cables, and hopefully we'll be able to sort out between the two so that whenever you guys go to buy cables or to, change them out for different ones, or you're going to set up a new system or whatever have you, that you're able to make better educated decisions when it comes to choosing which cables you want to buy. And so, most of you probably do as well, I browse around forums on the internet and things like that, and I see a lot of things and people talking about cables, this very subject that, a lot of it's good, a lot of it's bad. Some of it's been influenced by some marketing ploys that have kind of made their way into being fact when they're drawn from either pseudoscience or from things that maybe were true in the past but aren't really anymore. Because, when you think about it, the cable manufacturers are going to use every tool at their disposal to try and make their cables sound exciting. Because, at the end of the day, they're all selling cables. And cables aren't really that exciting by themselves. Certainly not as compared to the things they hook up, like, instruments and mics and amplifiers and effects processors and things like that. So they've got to jazz up cables somehow. And so sometimes that resorts to spreading some untrue rumors about how cables work and the way they behave. And so that's what I'm here today, is to kind of weed through that with you guys and see if we can't come out the other end more educated about what cables do, how they work, and the things that affect them as far as we care about it. And so to start off, there are basically three different aspects to a cable that affect how it performs. And so those three things are size, material, and building quality. And those three aspects I'll talk about each in turn, and we'll see how each one affects the way the cable performs and how that affects us in turn. And so to start out, we're talking about size. And so there's many different things to when you talk about the size of cables. And one is length, and we all kind of get that. We measure cables in length. So you got, little 3-foot patch cables. You got, 15-foot instrument cables. You have like 200-foot speaker cable, things like that. And we're also going to be talking about power cables too. So you can also have extension cords and things like that. We're all pretty much familiar with how we measure the length of cables, but there's also a term for measuring the thickness of cables, and that's represented by this term right here, which some of you might have known, some of you might not, but it's like right here. It's AWG, or AUG, as I pronounce it. I'm sure some other people do as well. Basically what it stands for is the American wire gauge. And so it's a standard we use here in America and some other places. I know in other places where the meter is a more prevalent form of measurement, they use a different system where it's the amount of turns or the amount of thickness per millimeter or something like that. So this might look a little foreign to people who are used to that system, but since this is the system I grew up with and know a lot about, I didn't want to bother about converting it. So if you need to, you can go ahead. But for this video, we're going to be using the AUG system. And so basically, this is a way of measuring how thick a cable's conductive element is, the actual part that's carrying signal. And so the numbers range from, a bunch of zeros to bigger numbers. And as the number gets bigger, the size of the conduit gets smaller. And so if you have something like an 8 to 12 AUG power cable, that's going to be bigger than a 22 to 24 AUG mic cable as far as the conductive material is concerned. And so if you take a cable apart, you take a power cable apart, you take a mic cable apart, the actual copper inside of it in the power cable is going to be bigger than the copper inside of the mic cable. And so the only thing you have to remember for this video is the bigger the AUG rating, the tinier the conduit is. So with that being said, I kind of have some other things we'll talk about, and that's the voltage levels for different signals we use in audio. And these are basically the 5 different levels of signal we use in audio. There's mic, there's instrument, there's line, there's speaker, and there's power. And these 5 levels all denote different things and where they are coming from and where they are going to. So for mic level, as it might be easy to see from the name, is the level of volts that comes out of a microphone. And this level of signal is really, really, really small. It's, 0.001 volts to about 0.01 volts. That's, pretty small when you think of, the 120 volts that comes out of your wall if you live in the US or other places, or 240 volts if you live across the pond, or other places as well that run off of 240. This is really, really small as compared to that. And so that steps up then. After that, we go to instrument level, which is 0.01 volts to 0.75 volts. 0.75 is going to be really high for instrument level. You'd have to have like some pretty serious active pickups, and technically then it wouldn't be instrument level after it because it'd be going through a preamp, which is technically be jumping it up, but that's room for debate. We'll say that, instrument level is the level that's coming out of a guitar or anything with a pickup in it that is changing the signal from one form or another is going to put out instrument level voltage. So between 0.01 volts and 0.75 volts, right around that area. Then we have line voltage, which is, this is the voltage that is going to connect your pieces of studio gear together. So whether it be an effects processor where you're coming out of your DAW into, let's say, a reverb, and then back from the reverb, the level of signal going in and out of that is going to be at line level, and it is going to be somewhere between 0.75 volts and 2 whole volts. 2 volts is going to be like the absolute maximum for a lot of things. Before, I'm sure a lot of things will probably clip before you ever reach that high. But that's about the range we're talking when we're talking about line level. And then speaker level is pretty much everything above that. And so from 2 volts to 200 volts and up, 2 volts is going to be like if you have like a little 16 watt combo feeding an 8 ohm speaker, the voltage coming out of the power amp of that combo is going to be at about 2 volts. And then that goes all the way up to if you have, say, 5,000 watt power amplifiers in bridge mode, feeding an 8 ohm speaker load, that's going to be somewhere around, 200 volts and up. So speaker level kind of runs a pretty wide level of power needs. And it really only gets paralleled to power, which, as we all know, is what comes out of the wall. So anywhere from 120 volts to 240 volts and everything in between, and some variances depending on how efficient your power is or how good your power grid is at home. It might go down, it might be higher. It all depends on where you live. And so the way we talk about how the size of a cable affects how the cable performs, to us, comes in 2 different aspects. So there's how much signal how efficient it is at getting the signal from one place to another. And so basically how much quieter does the signal get as it goes through the cable, which ideally would be 0. But we don't live in an ideal world, so your signal will be attenuated some bit anytime you take it from one place to another until there's some sort of perfect conduit you don't have yet. So we got to stick with our imperfect system. But even that's going to be pretty minuscule, as we're going to find out in just a minute. And so there's a signal level, and there's also what it does to the frequency response of the signal we're giving it. Because we work with audio, we don't just work with, voltages and things like that. We care about how the sound coming through the cable is. And so we want to see that, making sure that the cable isn't doing anything to the signal frequency-wise that we don't want it to. And we'll look how size affects that as well. And so to start off, we're going to talking about how the size affects signal level. And one of the myths I'm going to talk about right now is that, you know, some people make a lot of money selling really big, over-engineered power cables, you know, claiming things like, you know, because technically the voltage going through a cable is how loud the receiving device is going to see it. And so, like, the coming out of a microphone being at 0.001 volts, that's going to be really, really, really quiet. And you can't drive a speaker with that because you're not going to be able to hear it at 0.001 volts. So you have to go through a preamp, which takes it from mic level to line level. So then it jumps it up from 0.001 volts to around 1 volt to 2 volts. And that you can kind of start to drive a speaker with, but even then you have to worry about impedance stuff and things like that. So then you usually take it to a power amplifier, which does all that magic for you. And then you're about ready to hear it. But when it comes to the size of the cable, as we're going to see in a minute, you don't really need that big of a cable to ever carry as much signal as you would think. And so as we're going to find out, even I'm going to put up some, you know, some worst case scenarios for us in this table here. And you're going to see that, you know, even in those, the amount of cables we usually buy are going to be way more than proficient at doing the job they're supposed to do. So, you know, the idea comes from whenever so the thing that carries the electrical signal is bigger, it has less resistance because there's more places for electrons to go and all this stuff. And so the bigger the Ogg rating of a conduit, the less resistance it's going to have. And so, because ideally the conduit would have zero resistance, but because copper isn't a perfect conductor, it's pretty good. And its cost to effectiveness ratio is kind of why we use it so commonly today. But it's not perfect. And so it does have some resistance. So going through any amount of cable, like I said before, is going to attenuate signal a little bit. But if we look here, we have some common measurements for mic level signal. And going through a mic level, the common measurements for mic cables is around 22 to 24 Ogg. You can get some maybe at 21, but this is usually where it's going to be sitting at. You're going to get, if you go on to like Sweetwater or Guitar Center or, you know, whatever your local music vendor is, you pick up a mic cable off the shelf, odds are 9 times out of 10 it's going to be between 22 and 24 Ogg. And the way you check to see how much signal you're going to lose using a certain gauge of wire at a certain voltage is you do a big old fancy equation that is on some tables online if you want to look it up. I didn't want to throw it up here because then I just have more numbers on the screen and that just scare more of you guys off. So hopefully this amount of numbers is good to scare the least amount of you guys off as possible because I like having views. So please continue to watch my videos even though these numbers might scare you. So anyway, you do all this by fancy numbers and the fancy math that you can look up online, and it comes out to these numbers I have over here on the right. And so for a mic level, working at 22 to 24 Ogg, we'll take the worst case scenario, which means you have the tiniest cable you're probably going to get, which is 24 Ogg. Remember, the bigger the number, the tinier the cable. And that's driving the biggest resistance you're probably going to find. Average on a mic preamp is usually around 600 ohms. But that doesn't really matter for today. All you're going to do is you plug those numbers in. And basically for an average to worst case scenario with a mic, your signal loss for every 10 feet of mic cable at 24 AUG is only going to be 0.0425%. And that's just using standard copper, 24 AUG, nothing fancy, nothing like silver or any of the other stuff that gets overhyped or any of the bigger cables. It's not necessary. I mean, if you're going to hear, and this is in, voltage overall, so it's not even in dB. So it's even going to be less perceivable because you can only hear, even in the most studio controlled environments, you're going to struggle to hear half a dB of level change in anything. And so, 0.0425% of your signal getting lopped off for every 10 feet of cable you use a 24 AUG at a mic signal is almost inconsequential. Like you won't even notice that until you get up into, a couple, hundreds of feet, which most people aren't going to be doing anyway, because either it's just going to be impractical, or even for condenser microphones, a Phantom won't usually go that far because DC tends and like to travel long distances. And so usually we keep it, mic cables 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet. You're never going to hear that loss in signal. So, the standard 24 AUG, the tiniest amount you're usually going to find in a mic cable is going to be more than sufficient. So don't go trying to buy bigger AUGs for more money just because people say, oh, it's better conduit. No. You have the numbers right here. You know this now. Don't fall for it. So there's going to be a bunch of other things we're going to probably fall for later that we're going to talk about. So get this one out of the way. Your wallet and your studio will thank you for it. So, moving on to instrument level with the voltages we have there and the common AUGs, if you're walking to Guitar Center and buy a guitar cable, it's probably going to be between 18 and 22 AUG. Plug in all those numbers, nominal input impedance for a lot of things that a guitar is going to go into, say like a guitar amp or something like that, is usually, 1,000,000 ohms or something like that. And so you plug it into the equation, and using 22 AUG wire, which is probably going to be the smallest you're going to find off the shelf. Look at this number. 0.000016% signal loss every 10 feet at 22 AUG. And so you might be saying, oh, no, I can't use more than 25 feet cables because, it starts to sound really noisy when I turn it up. And that's true, but it's not because of the resistance of the cable. It's because an instrument level cable is usually unbalanced, which means it has no inherent noise canceling attributes. And so anything longer than 25 feet is probably just going to start picking up noise from things around it, from, electromagnetic interference and radio frequencies and things like that. So that's why you keep those cables short, is for noise aspects. And that's one aspect where expensive materials can help out a little bit. And it's one of the things they do better. We're going to talk about things that they don't do better later. But more expensive materials can make your cable less likely to pick up outside noise. But there's a bunch of other things you can usually do to limit that are usually a lot cheaper. But for things you can't control, it's nice to have things that are kind of built in to resist those. But for as far as we're concerned, for signal loss and things like that, as we're talking here, you're never going to hear, 0.000016% signal loss across any amount of wire for, thousands of feet. So don't even worry about it. Line level next, going at 0.25 at 2 volts at 22, 24 AUG wire, usually the same as mic cable, just usually different construction so that it's better resistant to things, because usually a line level signal is being wound around power cables because it's coming out of the back of your gear. And so it's going through a bunch of other stuff. So it's a little better shielded. And so it usually also has a little bit higher resistance to it. But then again, as you can see right here, every 10 feet at 24 AUG, you're only losing 0.005% of your signal. So to even get to 1%, you'd have to multiply this by what, 200? So what, 2 times 2,000 feet of line level cable before you even get to 1% signal loss from the resistance of the cable itself. So that should give a pretty good clear clue of what the next two and all the other things I'm going to say are, is that, looking at speaker and power level, it's still up there. It's definitely a bit bigger than 0.005, but even then again, it's still, look at speaker level using the worst case scenario, 14 og wire, that's still 0.31%. And for power, it's kind of the same, 0.27%. And so I know there was like a Pensado's place where he did like an into the layer on these power cables that had better, they were bigger and more strands wrapped together so that they're supposed to be better transferring voltage to your gear. And, that's where kind of these myths pop up, is because some of these things they say are true. It's just then they take the little last spin at the end that make it, not really applicable. Because in any active system, the voltage in equals the max headroom a unit can produce. And so, if you have active monitors, like I have Yamaha HS5s, which are active monitors. And so whenever I have my power cables plugged in, if I were to lower the voltage going into those amplifiers, first it would start to clip because the headroom of the amplifier built into the speakers would be shrunk proportional to how much voltage I am underfeeding it compared to what it's nominally supposed to be working at. And eventually it would just shut off because it wouldn't be able to function at all, and some things inside it just wouldn't be able to work. And so, if you knew that, then you'd be like, oh yeah, definitely. If my power cables are stealing voltage from my gear, then it is losing headroom, which is true. But still, again, we're talking about power cables with, say, 120 volts here in the US using, the worst case scenario, which is like a 12 og power cable. At 10 feet, you'd only be losing 0.27% of your final voltage. And I don't even know if people have cables running that far. Usually use power distributors, or even less than that. I don't think anybody's ever going to run a cable more than 20 feet tops. And still, that's like 0.5% at 120 volts. And so you're losing, what, 0.6 volts off of that? And the power grid fluctuates more than that. And that you can't control. So, if things sound fine just plugged into the power grid, getting a more expensive cable isn't going to fix or make your speakers or any other active system that much better. The power cables that ship with things are more than well suited for the job. So, don't buy into that either. Yes, bigger cables do help, but it's going to be so minimally improved that it's not worth the money at all. And so you have the numbers here to prove it. You can go look up the formulas to do these counts yourself. So whenever you're looking at things, you're trying to judge whether OG's good or not, you can figure it out for yourself. And so moving right along here, the other thing that people will talk about, and this is now moving on to frequency response of a cable. And it's like I said, we work with audio. We don't care that the signal gets there the same loudness. We also care about if it changes its frequency response at all, because we don't want cables inadvertently changing the frequency response of something we've worked so hard to keep the way we want it. And so one of these things you'll hear thrown around a lot is this term called skin effect. And basically what this is it's this, I don't know if you call it a phenomenon or something like that, where when you have frequencies traveling across a conduit, a solid conduit. So here we have a cable. Can't tell what it is. This is a cable looking on it dead on. If you have multiple frequencies going across this, the higher frequencies will tend to try and stick towards the outer edge of whatever they're traveling across. And so as the frequency goes up, the less and less of the center of the cable will start to be used. And what this does is it in effect makes, as far as the higher frequencies is concerned, they have less of a density of cable than the lower frequencies do. And as we know before, the smaller the conduit, the more resistance there is. And so basically what happens is the cable starts to act as kind of a low pass filter, where as the frequency gets higher, it has to work harder, and so it ends up getting quieter out the other end. And so people hear this because it is true, and when people hear this, they're like, "Oh man, I better get some some nice stuff so that way, or bigger cables so that when my high frequencies go through, they don't get messed up or things like that." And then cable manufacturers will throw it around as well, and all this stuff. And there's also these tables you can look up as well from people who aren't selling cables, and their job is to literally study this stuff. And it'll tell you what the frequency is that will start to experience this effect at certain gauges of wire. And I have this written down over here, and you might be looking at this and going, well, wait a second. Using, microphone wire, that seems to be fine because that's up in this range right here. And we can't hear anything up that high, so that's usually fine. But once we start getting it down into here, that's line level and speaker level range. What are we going to do with that? Like, that's clearly, we can hear, 17K getting rolled off. We can definitely hear 8.5 and 4.25K getting rolled off. So what's the deal with that? And the thing is, yes, as you get bigger gauges, the frequency roll off, or the point starts to roll off, is getting lower. And so for every 3 AUG gratings you go in any direction, the point at which the signal starts to get attenuated moves by an octave. And so as you can see here, these are all kind of divided by half because I'm going down in 3 AUG steps. But the thing is that this change only happens at about 1% dB per octave. And so what that means is that, taking an 18 AUG cable, for example, at 17K, by the time the signal reaches 34K, it's dropped by 1%. And that's not anything any of us ever have to worry about. Even if you were to work with like a 9 AUG cable for some reason, let alone the resistance and things like that, and how much overkill would work for something that's carrying full signal. Say you're using that, and it says this starts rolling off at 2K. That means by here it's lost 1%, here it's lost 2, here it's lost 3, and by the time it gets here, it doesn't matter. So really, 3% of the overall level of the high end has been rolled off, which I'd be surprised if anyone could hear that or miss it compared to all the other things that are going on. That is so inconsequentially small that there's no need to get worked up about it or to go and worry about having to balance this with, the stuff up here. It's all not as big of a deal as a bunch of other things you could be dumping money into. And that's really where we get to this final aspect here, where we get into build quality. And build quality is really what determines how well a cable works. Because you can have a bunch of really, really expensive parts put together really poorly, and it'll be a terrible cable. You'd probably be better off having a bunch of poor parts put together really well. You'll probably end up with a better cable and just throwing together some really, really expensive parts, but doing, half a job on it and getting a worse result. And so there are certain things that I've kind of put together about building and materials and things like that you want to either avoid or pay attention to or look for when looking for cables. And, we've all heard of like the Mogami gold stuff and things like that, where they use gold connectors and things like that. And technically gold is better as a connector type, but not for fidelity reasons. Running your cables through gold does not make it sound more expensive, contrary to popular belief. It is a little bit better of a conductor, but not by anything you're ever going to hear. The only benefit it gives to cables is that it is less corrosive. And so over time, it will corrode less than, say, silver or nickel plated connectors will. And so maybe it'll last longer that way. But from an audio standpoint, like the actual fidelity, you're not going to hear any difference between a gold plated cable and a silver plated cable or nickel plated cable. So, if you're going to buy gold, be sure you're only doing it for the fact that it just lasts longer and keeps the contacts cleaner than, say, a silver or nickel plate would. Don't do it because it'll sound better, because it won't. So, nickel and silver cables are good. They've been used on plenty of hit records before. I don't think they were ever thinking, oh man, if only this cable was gold plated, this record would have sounded so much better. No, there's way better things to be worrying about than whether your cables are gold plated or not. So, also one thing you want to avoid is sometimes companies will coat their cables in tin in order to make them easier to solder together later on to build the cables. And while technically that's a good thing, because easier solder means you can up the build quality as far as the contact to the rest of the cable is concerned, the problem is that, remember skin effect we talked about earlier? This tin goes on the surface of the cable. And so when you put tin on the surface of the cable, all the high frequencies are going to now move into that tin instead. And tin is a less productive conductor than copper is. And so it'll have more resistance. And so what'll happen is that the high frequencies will travel through the tin at a quieter rate than everything else is going to through the copper. And so what ends up happening is you end up losing high frequency response due to that, because their high frequencies will travel through the tin because it's on the outside as opposed to the copper on the inside. So try to avoid those if you can. There's also some terminology being thrown around about oxygen-free copper or linear crystal copper. They all sound fancy, and it's some newer stuff looking into actually the quality of the copper itself, where that has any effect on the audio quality going through it. And while there haven't been any scientific tests that I could find showing that the audio travels better through oxygen-free copper or linear crystal copper, there are a lot of people saying that it does sound better and things like that, but people say a lot of things sound better when they're the same or not any different at all. And so, our ears can trick us. So, if you want to look into that, go ahead. I wouldn't value it too much until we can get some solid data on this stuff, but there's other things you can worry about. So don't put too much stock in whether it's oxygen-free copper or linear crystal copper. It doesn't really matter that much until we figure out whether it's, does matter. So, as far as build quality goes, you also got shield type, serve or braided shield. Look for those. Foil is cheap and bad. It's not really that good. It's stiff and it breaks easier. And so try to get a swerve or braided shield if you can. One thing a lot of companies will try and say is that their shields are so good they can stop ground loop hum or 60 cycle hum or things like that. And yes, shields can affect it to a very, very minimal aspect. It's not what they're meant there to do. A cheaper option is, instead of buying more expensive cable to fix ground loop hum, just don't run your cables next to power cables or wind them up next to your amplifier, because that's going to do way more to solve your ground loop hum than buying nicer shielded cables. So watch out for that. Don't pay extra money for people to say that, because you're just going to be wasting your money on stuff that isn't really going to fix your problem. Insulation does matter, and the insulation is the part, inside a cable, you have, let's say, an instrument cable, you have the copper in the middle, and then you're going to have stuff around it that is going to separate it from the braided shield out here. And the braided shield is what's going to carry ground, and then the stuff in here is what's actually carrying your audio signal. And so this stuff in the middle, the shield, the insulator, separates the conduit from the shield, so that way they don't touch, and that way they don't short itself out, because if they touch, then you'd have a dead cable and it wouldn't really be doing that well. And so the insulation is kind of what you're going to get your money's worth for what you pay for. And so, because not only is it going to separate what the shield and the conduit are transmitting, therefore keeping the cable working, it's also, there's this thing called capacitance, which basically whenever you have two charges being separated by a non-conductive device, you basically have a capacitor. And so as far as looking at this cross-section of this cable goes, you have a charge here and a charge here, and then a non-conducting material in the middle. So as far as this cable is concerned, it's a capacitor. And capacitors have a tendency to kill high-end transient response. So the least amount of capacitance you can get in your cable, the better. And so this is where a lot of the more expensive cables kind of get their own, is that they do a better job of reducing capacitance, so that way your high end and your transient response stays intact, as opposed to cheaper cables, which don't do this as well. And so then they tend to sound duller and more muffled and things like that. And so usually anything that's made with polyethylene as the separator, a while ago this used to be made with rubber, but I think nowadays pretty much almost everything is made with polyethylene. So you can check, if it says rubber, don't do it, because the weird thing is that rubber is actually going to be more expensive than a polyethylene isolator. So you're actually going to be probably saving money by getting a nicer cable in that aspect. And so, just keep an eye out for that. And, there's a bunch of different aspects that can go into it, and whether they're build quality, how they're soldered together, what is the quality of the actual jacks? Are they cheap Chinese ones that break and then they don't get any contact? How well is the cable as far as stress relief things go? So how long will it last on the road and things like that? There's a million different factors that'll go into how a cable performs. And so hopefully we've kind of weeded through all the different factors that you may hear, and hopefully we've all come out of this with a better understanding of what makes a cable a good cable and what doesn't matter, so that whenever we're going out there and buying cables, we have a better basis from which to value the different aspects. So whether we know, hey, do I need a gold-plated cable? Probably not. Do I need a cable with good isolation between the conduit and the ground? Probably. And so you can rate these different aspects. So, no matter what the marketing jargon says, you can weed through it and say, okay, this is what I want. I don't need this, so I shouldn't be paying extra money for anything I don't need. So that's all I want to talk about today. This video was a little longer than most of mine, so hopefully you guys have stuck through it till the end here. I hope you guys learned something. If you did, please like and subscribe and share with people who you think could also learn something from this video. Until the next time, go make some awesome music with any cable you want, as long as you know it'll do a good job, because you've watched this video and know everything you need to know about it. So, I've been Ryan. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye.